The howling wind carried Grace Foster's desperate cries across the barren plains of Wyoming Territory as she stumbled through the darkness, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other gripping a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world. It was 1878, and the autumn night was merciless cold enough to kill a woman in her condition, especially one who had just been thrown out of the only shelter for miles around. Grace had arrived at Holloway's Inn just as the sun was setting, her chestnut hair disheveled from days of travel, her green eyes hollow with exhaustion. The stagecoach had left her at the crossroads with directions to the inn, promising it would be just a short walk. That short walk had felt endless to her 8 months pregnant body. "I need a room, please," she had told the innkeeper, a narrow-faced man whose eyes had immediately fallen to her protruding belly and then to her ringless left hand. "We don't serve your kind here," he'd said, his voice sharp as a whip. "This is a respectable establishment. Please," Grace had begged, placing her last few coins on the counter. "Just for tonight. I'm continuing to Sweetwater tomorrow. My cousin is expecting me." But the innkeeper had been unmoved. "Should have thought about consequences before you got yourself in trouble, miss. Now get out before my wife comes down. She'd have a fit seeing someone like you under our roof." So Grace had found herself thrust back into the night, the door of Holloway's Inn slamming behind her with such finality that she'd nearly collapsed right there on the porch. The baby kicked hard, as if protesting their cruel treatment, and Grace murmured soothing words despite her own panic. She'd been walking for nearly an hour when she spotted a small light in the distance. A ranch house, perhaps, or a farm. Hope surged through her, though she tamped it down quickly. Who would welcome a stranger in the night, especially one in her condition? The light grew closer, revealing itself to be a lantern hanging outside a large barn. Beside it stood a modest cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. Grace paused at the edge of the property, debating. The baby kicked again, more insistently this time, and a sharp pain radiated across her lower back. "All right, little one," she whispered. "I hear you." She approached the barn first, thinking perhaps she could slip inside and find a place in the hay without disturbing the residents. As she reached for the heavy wooden door, it swung open suddenly, causing her to stumble backward with a startled cry. A tall figure loomed in the doorway, silhouetted by the lantern light. A man, broad-shouldered and holding what looked like a rifle. "Who's there?" His voice was deep, cautious, but not immediately threatening. Grace stepped forward, allowing the light to fall on her face. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir." She paused as another pain seized her, this one strong enough to make her double over, the rifle lowered immediately. "Good Lord, are you in labor?" "No," she gasped, straightening with effort. "Not yet, I don't think, just tired. I was at Holloway's, but they wouldn't let me stay." The man stepped fully into the light, and Grace could see him clearly now, ruggedly handsome with dark hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. He wore simple clothes, worn but clean, and a weathered cowboy hat. Holloway turned away a pregnant woman at night. His jaw tightened. That man never did have much of a soul. He propped his rifle against the barn wall and stepped closer, moving cautiously as if approaching a frightened animal. "I'm Kieran Gallagher. This is my ranch." "Grace Foster," she replied, swaying slightly on her feet. In one swift motion, Kieran closed the distance between them, placing a steadying hand on her elbow. "You need to sit down, Miss Foster. Come inside." "I don't want to impose," Grace said, even as she leaned gratefully into his support. "Maybe just a corner of your barn for the night." "I'll be gone by sunrise." Kieran looked at her as if she'd suggested swimming across the North Platte in winter. "A corner of my barn, for a woman in your condition, not a chance." He guided her toward the barn door. "Let me get a fire going in here first." The cabin's not fit for company, been living like a bachelor too long. Inside, the barn was surprisingly clean and well organized. Stalls lined one side, housing 3 horses who peered curiously at the newcomers. The other side held farm equipment, bags of feed, and a small area with a wooden table and chairs that appeared to serve as a workshop. Kieran led Grace to the chairs and helped her sit before moving efficiently around the space, gathering wood for the large iron stove in the corner. Within minutes, he had a fire blazing, its warmth already beginning to chase away the chill that had settled into Grace's bones. "Where are you headed?" he asked as he worked, pulling a coffee pot from a shelf and filling it with water from a barrel. "Sweet water," Grace replied, watching his capable hands. "My cousin Harriet lives there with her husband. She's expecting me, though not for another week or so." Kieran nodded, setting the coffee to boil. "That's a good 2 days' ride from here, even in good weather, and you're traveling alone." Grace lowered her eyes. "Yes, my father passed last spring, and then when he found out about..." She gestured to her belly. "Well, Samuel decided he wasn't ready for a family after all." She hadn't meant to share so much with a stranger, but there was something about Kieran Gallagher that invited confidence. Perhaps it was the absence of judgment in his eyes, or simply the kindness he'd shown when others had turned her away. "Samuel sounds like a fool," Kieran said matter-of-factly as he pulled a blanket from a trunk and draped it around her shoulders. The unexpected gesture brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the blanket tighter. Kieran busied himself preparing a simple meal: biscuits, some dried beef, and a jar of preserved peaches that he seemed particularly proud of. "Grew these myself," he explained as he served them. "The trees are just starting to produce well." They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional soft nickering of the horses. Grace hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was before her, and she had to remind herself to eat slowly. "How long have you been here?" she asked eventually, genuinely curious about this solitary cowboy who'd opened his door to a stranger in need. 5 years, Kieran replied, leaning back in his chair. "Came west after the war with nothing but my horse and what I could carry. Worked cattle drives until I saved enough for this place." He gestured around them. "It's not much yet, but it's mine. Good grazing land, clean water, planning to build a proper house next year." "It's lovely," Grace said sincerely. The ranch had a peaceful quality to it, despite the modest accommodations. She could see why he'd chosen this spot, with the rolling hills surrounding them and the distant mountains etched against the horizon. Kieran studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You should take my bed in the cabin. I'll sleep out here with the horses." Grace shook her head firmly. "I couldn't possibly. You've already been too kind. This is perfect." She patted the hay bale she was seated on. "Better than walking all night." A small smile tugged at the corner of Kieran's mouth. "Stubborn, aren't you?" "I've had to be," she replied simply. His smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "I respect that, but I insist on making you comfortable at least." He stood and disappeared into one of the stalls, returning with an armful of clean hay. Efficiently, he arranged it in the corner farthest from the door but close to the stove, creating a thick bed on the wooden floor. Next came blankets, surprisingly many of them, and in good condition, which he layered over the hay. Finally, he added a pillow that looked suspiciously like the one from his own bed. "There," he said, stepping back to assess his work. "Not exactly the Palmer House in Chicago, but it should keep you warm for the night." Grace was touched by the care he'd taken. "It looks wonderful, truly?" Kieran nodded, seemingly satisfied, and began clearing away their meal. "I'll be in the cabin if you need anything. Just call out. I'm a light sleeper." He paused at the barn door, looking back at her with those clear blue eyes. "Lock this behind me. Not that there's much trouble out here, but better safe than sorry." After he left, Grace did as instructed, turning the heavy iron key in the lock. Then she settled onto her makeshift bed, which was surprisingly comfortable. The warmth from the stove wrapped around her like a cocoon, and for the first time in months she felt safe. The baby shifted within her, more gently now, as if settling down for the night. "We'll be all right," she whispered, one hand resting on her belly. "We found a good man tonight." She hadn't meant to fall asleep so quickly, but exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, pulling her into a deep, dreamless slumber. Grace awoke with a gasp, pain radiating across her abdomen. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting the barn in shadows. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back Holloway's Inn, the long walk in the dark, the kind cowboy who'd given her shelter. Another pain seized her, this one stronger than the last, and Grace realized with sudden clarity what was happening. The baby was coming weeks earlier than expected. "No," she whispered frantically. "Not here, not now." She tried to stand, thinking she should call for Kieran, but the pain drove her back down to the blankets. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she fought against the scream building in her throat. When the contraction passed, she drew a shaky breath and called out, "Mr. Gallagher, Kieran." Her voice sounded weak even to her own ears, likely not carrying beyond the thick barn walls. Grace looked around desperately for something to make noise with and spotted a metal pail hanging near the stove. If she could just reach it. She had barely managed to drag herself a few feet when another contraction hit, more powerful than the last. This time, she couldn't hold back the cry that tore from her throat. The barn door rattled, then there was pounding. "Grace, are you all right? Open the door." "The key," she gasped, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "It's in the lock." More rattling, then a moment of silence followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the door. Once, twice, and on the third impact, the door burst open, revealing Kieran with his shoulder lowered like a battering ram. He took in the scene in an instant. Grace on the floor, halfway between her bed and the stove, clearly in distress. He was at her side in 3 long strides, kneeling beside her. "The baby?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Grace nodded, clutching at his arm as another contraction began to build. "Too early," she managed to say before the pain overwhelmed her. Kieran's expression was calm, though his eyes betrayed his concern. "Let's get you back to the bed," he said, gently helping her to her feet during a brief respite between contractions. Once she was settled, he stoked the fire and added more wood, building it up until the barn was filled with warm, golden light. Then he filled a kettle with water and set it to boil. "I've helped deliver foals and calves," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "And I assisted when my sister had her boy back in '72. Not exactly a doctor, but I know the basics." Grace would have laughed if she weren't so terrified. "I haven't even done this before," she admitted. "I don't know what to do." Kieran's expression softened as he knelt beside her. "Your body knows, even if you don't. We'll figure it out together." He reached for her hand, his large, calloused palm enveloping her smaller one. "I won't leave you, I promise," and he didn't. Through the long hours that followed, as Grace's labor progressed and the night deepened around them, Kieran remained steadfast. He bathed her forehead with cool water, supported her back when she needed to change positions, and spoke to her in a low, steady voice that somehow cut through the worst of the pain. "You're doing fine," he assured her again and again. "Strong as any woman I've ever met." When dawn began to lighten the sky outside, casting pale fingers of light through the barn windows, Grace felt a shift, a new pressure, an overwhelming urge. "I think," she gasped, gripping Kieran's hand with crushing force. "I think it's time." Kieran nodded, his face serious but unafraid. "I can see the head, dark hair like yours." The next few minutes were a blur of pain and effort unlike anything Grace had ever experienced. She was vaguely aware of Kieran's voice guiding her, his hands steady and sure as they helped bring her child into the world, and then, suddenly, it was over. A tiny, indignant cry filled the barn, and Kieran was placing a small, red-faced bundle on her chest. "A girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a daughter, Grace." Grace looked down at the perfect little face, the shock of dark hair, the tiny fists already waving in protest at this cold, bright world. Love swept through her with such force that she could barely breathe. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tracing a finger along her daughter's cheek. "I'm your mama." She looked up to find Kieran watching them, something unreadable in his expression. "Thank you," she said, the words wholly inadequate for what he'd done. "I don't know what would have happened if, but it didn't," he interrupted gently. "You're both here and you're both safe." After cleaning up and ensuring both mother and child were comfortable, Kieran disappeared briefly to the cabin, returning with a small wooden box. "I made this for my sister's boy," he explained, setting it beside Grace's bed. "Never got around to sending it. Thought it might serve as a cradle for now." The box was beautifully crafted, sanded smooth and lined with soft fabric. It was perfect for the tiny newborn who was now sleeping peacefully, swaddled in one of Kieran's clean shirts. "It's beautiful," Grace said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "You're a man of many talents, Mr. Gallagher." A hint of color touched his cheeks. "My father was a carpenter, taught me a few things before he passed." Grace wanted to ask more about his father, his life before Wyoming. Everything but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. Kieran must have noticed, for he tucked the blankets more securely around her and the baby. "Rest now," he said softly. "I'll be right here if you need anything." The next few days passed in a gentle rhythm of feeding, sleeping, and slowly regaining strength. Kieran proved to be an attentive host, bringing meals, stoking the fire, and even awkwardly holding the baby whom Grace had named Lily while Grace washed and changed clothes. "She's got a good grip," he observed on the third day as Lily's tiny hand wrapped around his finger. Strong like her mother, Grace smiled, watching them from her bed where she was folding laundry Kieran had washed for her. "She likes you. She's usually fussier with strangers." "I'm hardly a stranger now," Kieran pointed out, carefully returning Lily to her makeshift cradle. "Though I suppose I will be once you're well enough to continue to Sweetwater." The thought brought an unexpected pang to Grace's heart. She had grown accustomed to Kieran's quiet presence, his understated kindness, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "I should write to Harriet," she said, pushing the feeling aside. "Let her know what's happened and that we'll be delayed." Kieran nodded. "I can ride into town tomorrow and send a telegraph for you." "Thank you." Grace hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind. "Won't you be wanting your barn back soon? I'm sure this is disrupting your work." Kieran looked around at the space that had been transformed into a temporary home for Grace and Lily, clothes hanging to dry near the stove, the wooden box cradle, Grace's few possessions neatly arranged beside her bed. "I like the company," he said simply. "Been alone too long, I think." Over the next week, as Grace grew stronger and Lily thrived, Kieran found more and more excuses to spend time in the barn. He moved his carving bench inside, working on small wooden toys for Lily while he talked with Grace. They shared stories of their childhoods, hers in Philadelphia, his in a small farming community in Illinois, and their dreams for the future. "I always wanted land of my own," Kieran confessed one evening as they sat by the stove, Lily sleeping peacefully in her cradle. "Something to build on, to leave behind someday. For your children?" Grace asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Maybe, if that's in the cards for me." "You'd make a wonderful father," Grace said without thinking, then flushed when his eyes met hers. "That's kind of you to say," he replied softly. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither was ready to name. Grace looked away first, focusing on the flame dancing in the stove. "What about you?" Kieran asked after a moment. "What did you dream of before? Before I found myself pregnant and abandoned." Grace finished with a wry smile. "I wanted to teach. I was good with numbers, and I thought perhaps a small school somewhere." "You still could," Kieran suggested. "Sweetwater's growing, they might need teachers." Grace nodded, though the thought of Sweetwater no longer filled her with the anticipation it once had. She found herself increasingly reluctant to leave the safety and warmth of Kieran's ranch, though she knew she couldn't impose on his hospitality forever. When Lily was 2 weeks old, a reply came from Harriet. Kieran brought the telegram from town, handing it to Grace with an unreadable expression. Grace read it quickly, her heart sinking. Harriet's husband has taken a new position in Denver. They're leaving Sweetwater at the end of the month. She looked up at Kieran. She says I'm still welcome to join them, but Denver's a long way for a woman traveling alone with a newborn, Kieran finished for her. Grace nodded, feeling the walls closing in. Her plans, already tenuous, were crumbling completely. I'll need to find work somewhere closer, I suppose. Maybe back in Laramie. Kieran was silent for a long moment, absently stroking one of the horses that had wandered over to nuzzle his shoulder. Finally, he turned to her, his expression serious but with a warmth in his eyes that made her breath catch. You could stay, he said simply. Grace stared at him, not sure she'd heard correctly. Stay here? Yes. He took a step toward her, then seemed to think better of it and stopped. I have the space. The cabin needs work, but with some improvements it could be comfortable for a family, and I'd build a proper house next summer like I planned. A family, Grace repeated, her mind spinning. Kieran took a deep breath. I know it's sudden. We've only known each other a few weeks, but I care for you, Grace, and for Lily. I think we could build something good here if you're willing. Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must hear it. Are you proposing marriage, Kieran Gallagher? He smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. I believe I am, Grace Foster, not very romantically, I'm afraid. Grace looked around the barn where she'd found shelter on a cold night, where her daughter had been born, where she'd begun to heal in more ways than one. She thought of Kieran's steady hands guiding Lily into the world, his quiet companionship, the way he looked at both of them as if they were precious beyond measure. I think it's perfectly romantic, she said softly, and was rewarded with another of those transformative smiles. Kieran closed the distance between them then, taking her hands in his. Is that a yes? Grace looked up into his clear blue eyes, seeing in them a future she hadn't dared to hope for. Yes, she whispered. Yes, it is. Their wedding was a simple affair, held in the small church in town with only a few of Kieran's neighbors as witnesses. The minister raised an eyebrow at the newborn in Grace's arms, but asked no questions. Perhaps silenced by the protective way Kieran stood beside his bride, or by the obvious devotion in both their faces as they spoke their vows. Spring came to the Wyoming plains, bringing with it new life and new beginnings. Kieran expanded the cabin as promised, adding a proper bedroom for them and a smaller one for Lily. Grace planted a garden, putting down literal roots in this land that had become her home. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch Kieran had built, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Lily, growing plumper and more alert by the day, would coo and babble in Grace's lap while Kieran told stories of the day's work on the ranch. I never expected this, Grace confessed one such evening as Kieran gently rocked Lily's cradle with his foot. When I was turned away from that inn, I thought it was the end of everything, but it was just the beginning. Kieran reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Sometimes the worst nights lead us exactly where we need to be, he said quietly. As if in agreement, Lily gave a happy gurgle, waving her tiny fists in the air. Grace smiled down at her daughter, then at the man who had chosen to be her father in every way that mattered. I love you, she said, the words still new enough to send a thrill through her when she spoke them aloud. Kieran's eyes, blue as the Wyoming sky, softened as they always did when she said those words. And I love you, Mrs. Gallagher, both of you more than I ever thought possible. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above the peaceful ranch, Grace thought of how far she had come from that desperate night, not just in healing and strength, but in finding a love and home she'd never dared to dream of. Life in the West was not easy, but with Kieran beside her and Lily in her arms, Grace knew she had everything she needed to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The barn where it had all begun still stood nearby, now used for its intended purpose. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howled across the plains, Grace would remember a frightened young woman seeking shelter and the cowboy who had opened not just his barn door but his heart. Years later, When Lily was old enough to understand, they would tell her the story of her birth not as a tale of abandonment and desperation, but as the beginning of their family's journey together. And on each anniversary of that night, Kieran would light a special fire in the barn stove, a reminder of how a single act of kindness had changed all their lives forever. Some might call it fate, Kieran would say, his arm around Grace's waist as they watched the flames dance. I call it love, Grace would reply, leaning into the strength and warmth of the man who had become her home. And in the fullness of time, as their family grew and the ranch prospered, that love remained their constant, as enduring as the mountains on the horizon and as boundless as the western sky above them.